Ellen DeGeneres wasn't just a talk show host. She was a cultural phenomenon. A woman who turned silence into laughter, pain into punchlines, and controversy into conversations that reshaped American television forever. She made us laugh. She made us dance. She made us believe that kindness was more than a catchphrase. It was a way of life. But behind the standing ovations and daytime smiles was a journey far more complicated and far more painful. Because while the world watched her rise to fame, very few saw the battles she fought just to survive. Battles against trauma, rejection, backlash, and later, betrayal by the very system she helped elevate. And now, as she enters her 70s, the final chapter of her life is no longer about dancing across studio stages, but about living with the quiet truth of everything it cost her to get there. This is the story of Ellen DeGeneres, the rise, the fall, the love, the loneliness, the scandal, and the silence that followed. And what we uncover next will change the way you see her forever. Before the laughter, before the lights, before the world knew her name, Ellen DeGeneres was just a young girl growing up in Metairie, Louisiana, trying to make sense of a world that didn't make space for her pain. Born on January 26, 1958, Ellen was the youngest of two children in a modest middle-class home. Her father, Elliot, sold insurance. Her mother, Betty, kept the household running. It was quiet, unremarkable, and for a brief moment safe. But safety is fragile. And at 15, Ellen watched it all collapse. Her parents divorced in 1973. Her brother, Vance, stayed behind with their father. Ellen followed her mother into a new chapter in Atlanta, Texas, a chapter that began with promises and ended in silence. Inside, that new home was a man who shattered her innocence. Her stepfather, the man meant to protect her, crossed boundaries no child should ever face. And in a moment of unspeakable courage, Ellen told her mother the truth. But Betty, fighting her own battle with breast cancer, couldn't see past her own pain. She didn't believe her, not out of cruelty, but out of denial. For Ellen, that disbelief was a second betrayal. The first was what happened. The second was having no one to stand beside her. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was paralyzing. And from that silence, a wound was born, one that wouldn't heal for decades. But somewhere deep inside, Ellen made a choice. If the world refused to protect her, she would build her own shield. And she did it with the sharpest weapon she could find: laughter. Not laughter for joy, but laughter for survival. A quick wit to deflect pain. A punchline to silence the scream. It was humor forged in darkness. She didn't laugh because life was funny. She laughed because it was the only thing keeping her alive. And that laugh, the one the world would one day come to love, was born not from privilege, but from pain. But escaping trauma didn't mean escaping struggle. What came next was a battle with poverty, hunger, and invisibility. A young woman with nothing but a notebook full of jokes, and a dream she didn't dare say out loud. And that's where her real fight began. When Ellen left college after just one semester at the University of New Orleans, she wasn't walking away from education. She was walking into survival. With no degree, no connections, and no plan beyond sheer instinct, she returned to New Orleans with one thing: a belief, fragile and flickering, that she was meant for something more. But dreams are expensive. And Ellen was broke. She waited tables, folded shirts, painted houses, answered phones, worked in restaurants thick with cigarette smoke and kitchens that smelled of grease and desperation. Some nights she walked home with nothing but aching feet and a few loose coins that barely paid for the next day's meal. Her rent was always due. Her cupboards always nearly empty. She stretched a few crumpled dollars across a week like a magician, rationing slices of bread, skipping meals, and praying the lights wouldn't go out. This wasn't the struggle you read about in books. It was real, cold, humbling. And yet, in those backbreaking years, something powerful was being forged. Because when you've been invisible long enough, you start to sharpen your voice, not to entertain, but to survive. Ellen carried a battered notebook filled with scraps of ideas, scribbled jokes, observations from her waitress shifts, absurd moments that only she could turn into something meaningful. At night, in dimly lit rooms with peeling walls and secondhand lamps, she practiced alone. Sometimes in front of a cracked mirror, sometimes to her cat. Her audience didn't clap, but she performed anyway. Those nights were not glamorous. They were heartbreaking. She wasn't writing for fame. She was writing to stay alive. Every joke she rehearsed was a defiance of the silence that once tried to crush her. Every line she perfected was one more brick in the foundation of the woman she was becoming. By the early 1980s, Ellen began performing at local comedy clubs, tiny stages where half the audience was drunk and the other half indifferent. She bombed. She froze. She sweat under the spotlight, but she kept coming back because laughter, even when rare, was the first real currency she ever earned. And one night, that persistence paid off. Word began to spread. There was a woman on the New Orleans circuit with sharp timing, razor wit, and a strange, quiet confidence that stuck with you long after the show ended. She wasn't chasing stardom. She was chasing survival, but stardom was coming faster than she could. Imagine. And the man who would change her life forever was just a few stages away. For a young comedian in the 1980s, there was only one true finish line: the stage of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. It wasn't just a gig, it was a coronation. A spot on that show meant you had arrived. But to be invited to sit on the couch, that was rare. That was sacred. That was legendary. And in 1986, after years of grinding in smoke-filled clubs for chump change and scattered applause, Ellen DeGeneres got the call. She was nervous, terrified even. Her hands trembled, her stomach twisted. But she had prepared for this moment in silence, in hunger, in heartbreak. Her comedy wasn't loud or crude, it was precise. Soft-spoken but sharp. Observational, self-deprecating, and disarmingly smart. She walked out under the bright lights of The Tonight Show with the weight of her entire life behind. Her childhood trauma, financial struggle, nights alone with only her reflection for company. And somehow, she made a miracle laugh. But the moment that changed everything wasn't the jokes. It was what came after. Johnny Carson laughed, genuinely. And then he did something he had only done for a select few. He gestured to the couch. Ellen DeGeneres had just been invited into comedy's inner circle, live on national television. And just like that, a star was born, not overnight, but after years of being ignored, broken, and unseen. That night wasn't just about comedy. It was about validation. It was about a young woman who had been told no for most of her life, finally hearing yes in front of millions. America leaned in. And for the first time, Ellen felt what it was like to be truly heard. What followed was a steady rise: guest appearances, comedy specials, acting roles. The woman who once rehearsed to a cracked mirror was now being welcomed into living rooms across the country. But success has a funny way of testing people, and Ellen's next test would push her to the very edge of everything she had built. By the mid-1990s, Ellen DeGeneres wasn't just a rising star, she was a household name. After years of struggle, she had landed the dream, her very own primetime sitcom, Ellen. It was witty, fresh, and built around her unique brand of offbeat humor. The same awkward charm that had once made her a standout in dingy clubs was now lighting up millions of television screens. But behind the laughter, she was carrying a secret, one that threatened everything. Ellen was gay, and hiding it from the world wasn't just exhausting. It was unbearable. She played a straight character, smiled through interviews, dodged questions, lived in fear that the truth, if spoken out loud, would shatter everything she had fought for. And in 1997, she decided to stop hiding. It was one of the boldest moves in television history. In what would become known as the puppy episode, Ellen's character came out on national television, and so did Ellen herself. It was raw. It was revolutionary. It was the moment her real life and her TV life finally aligned. But America wasn't ready. In the blink of an eye, applause turned into backlash. Conservative groups protested. Advertisers pulled out. Network executives panicked. Tabloids sharpened their knives. The very industry that had once celebrated her turned cold and calculating. A year later, Ellen was canceled, not for lack of ratings or talent, but because one woman dared to tell the truth. Ellen had walked into history with courage and was met with silence, rejection, and exile. She disappeared from the spotlight. Offers dried up. Doors closed. The phone stopped ringing. The woman who had once sat on Johnny Carson's couch now found herself alone again, this time punished for being honest. It was the darkest chapter of her career. But it wasn't the end. Because for Ellen, authenticity wasn't just a risk. It was a promise she had made to herself and to anyone who'd ever been told to stay silent. And while the world tried to erase her, she was quietly planning her return. When Ellen DeGeneres vanished from television after the cancellation of her sitcom in 1998, many thought it was the final chapter. Hollywood had closed its doors. Public opinion had turned cold. And in an era still uncomfortable with honesty, there was no room left for her voice. But Ellen wasn't finished. For 5 long years, she worked quietly. Small comedy gigs, voiceover roles, anything to stay afloat. Some say she was rebuilding. Others say she was just surviving. But deep down, she was waiting for the moment she could rewrite the narrative. That moment came in 2003. A new network. A new time slot. A bold new idea. A daytime talk show built on laughter, lightness, and love. The Ellen DeGeneres Show was a gamble. No one knew if the public would accept her again. But when the cameras rolled and Ellen danced across the stage with that signature grin, something unexpected happened. America said yes. And not just yes, but a resounding yes. Audiences returned in droves. Ratings soared. The show became a phenomenon, not because of celebrity guests or giveaways, but because Ellen made people feel good. She made kindness cool. She made millions laugh at a time when the world desperately needed hope. She wasn't just rebuilding her career. She was redefining it. Ellen gave away cars, paid off student loans, changed leaves with a smile and a surprise. Her show became a daily sanctuary, a place where laughter wasn't just entertainment, it was therapy. And her impact spread far beyond the stage. In 2003, she voiced Dory in Finding Nemo, the forgetful but lovable fish that swam straight into the hearts of millions. It became one of the most iconic animated characters of all time, so beloved, in fact, that Finding Dory arrived more than a decade later and shattered box office records. She hosted the Oscars, the Emmys, the Grammys, effortlessly charming audiences across every platform. Her selfies with Hollywood's elite broke the internet. Her influence became undeniable. And then, in 2016, it all came full circle. President Barack Obama placed the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck, the highest civilian honor in the United States, not for her comedy, but for her courage, for being a trailblazer, a survivor, a symbol of what it meant to stand tall in your truth. It was one of the most emotional moments of her life. The same truth that once destroyed her career had now made her a national treasure. But while the cameras captured the smiles and accolades, A storm was quietly forming, because empires built on perfection are the most fragile of all. And Ellen's kingdom of kindness was about to face its harshest reckoning. For nearly 2 decades, the Ellen DeGeneres Show stood as a symbol of joy, of dancing down aisles, surprise giveaways, and heartfelt stories that ended in hugs and applause. But in 2020, that image began to crack. And once it did, it shattered. It started with a tweet. On March 20th, 2020, in the heart of a global lockdown, comedian Kevin T. Porter posted a message that would ripple through Ellen's empire like an earthquake. "Right now, we all need a little kindness," he wrote. You know, like Ellen DeGeneres always talks about. She's also notoriously one of the meanest people alive. Respond with your stories. What began as a sarcastic tweet turned into an open floodgate. Thousands responded. Former employees, fans, crew members, service staff. Some told mild anecdotes. Others alleged something deeper: fear, control, punishment for small mistakes. Even a workplace where people were reportedly told not to look Ellen in the eye. Suddenly, the woman who had built her brand on "be kind to one another" was accused of the opposite. The media pounced. Old interviews resurfaced, awkward moments with Mariah Carey, Taylor Swift, and Dakota Johnson, now viewed in a darker light. Whispers turned into headlines. Doubt turned into condemnation. And then came the breaking point. In July 2020, BuzzFeed News published an explosive expose. 10 former employees described what they called a toxic work environment behind the scenes of Ellen's show. An atmosphere of fear, silence, and retaliation. The most damning allegations were aimed not just at the star herself, but at 3 senior producers accused of serious misconduct. Warner Media launched an internal investigation. Staff was shaken. Producers were fired. And Ellen, who had once been untouchable, was forced to respond. When the show returned that fall, she stood alone on stage and said the words the world was waiting for. "I take responsibility for what happens at my show. This is the Ellen DeGeneres Show. I am Ellen DeGeneres." It was a moment of humility. Or at least it was meant to be. But for many, the damage had already been done. The apology landed softly, laced with nervous jokes and flashes of discomfort. Some found it sincere. Others said it came too late. Ratings plummeted. Sponsors pulled back. Her once sterling reputation, carefully built over decades, had become a public question mark. Supporters like Katy Perry and Kevin Hart came to her defense. But others, including celebrities like Brad Garrett and Leah Thompson, publicly confirmed the reports. The divide was undeniable. The house that kindness built now stood in shadow. And in May 2021, after 19 seasons, Ellen announced the end of her show. She said it was simply no longer a challenge. But for those watching closely, the writing was already on the wall. What was once a joyful refuge had become a stage she could no longer stand on. And when that final episode aired in 2022, filled with tearful goodbyes and full-circle moments, it felt less like a farewell party and more like a quiet surrender. The applause was still there, but the magic WAN single quotes T. And behind her smile, many could see what they hadn't noticed before: exhaustion, disillusionment, and something deeper, something far more human. The realization that even the brightest lights eventually flicker. While the world watched Ellen's career rise and fall, what many didn't see was the battle unfolding behind the cameras within her heart. Because for Ellen, love had never come easy. It had always been a battlefield where truth came at a price, and where intimacy often collided with judgment, scrutiny, and fear. In 1997, just as she came out to the world on her sitcom, she walked onto the red carpet holding hands with actress Anne Heche. That one gesture, 2 women, smiling unapologetically in love, set off a cultural explosion. Their relationship wasn't just romance. It was rebellion, but the cost was brutal. Hollywood shut its doors. Ellen's career collapsed. Anne faced rejection from her own family and the industry. Their love, once fierce and visible, slowly crumbled under the weight of a society that wasn't ready to accept it. When it ended in 2000, Ellen was left with more than heartbreak. She was left with scars deep, public, and painful. She tried again. In 2001, she found solace with photographer Alexandra Hedison. It was a quieter love, a refuge after the storm. But even that couldn't last. Ellen was still rebuilding, still haunted, still too fractured to fully let someone in. And by 2004, that chapter ended too quietly, respectfully, but with the ache of something unfinished. And then came Portia. Portia de Rossi wasn't just another love interest. She was the turning point, the healing. When they met in 2004, both women were scarred. Portia, battling hidden eating disorders and the shame of hiding her identity. Ellen, still carrying the wreckage of lost love and public rejection. But when they looked at each other, it wasn't just attraction, it was understanding, recognition, a mirror reflecting pain and possibility. Love wasn't explosive. It was steady, real, a slow-burning trust that bloomed quietly behind the scenes. And in 2008, when California briefly legalized same-sex marriage, Ellen and Portia didn't hesitate. In an intimate ceremony at their Beverly Hills home, surrounded by close friends and family, they said the words they once believed they'd never be allowed to say, "I do." It wasn't just a wedding. It was a revolution wrapped in soft vows. Two women, once punished for being visible, now standing in love legally, openly, proudly. And when the storms returned in 2020, the scandals, the headlines, the whisper campaigns, Portia didn't run. She stood taller. While the world questioned Ellen, Portia offered only 4 words that cut through the noise like a lifeline. "I stand by Ellen." She became more than a wife. She became Ellen's anchor, her protector, her sanctuary. Through therapy sessions, medical appointments, sleepless nights, and soul-searching days, Portia stayed. She slowed her steps to match Ellen's, reshaped their home to accommodate her pain, built a life that wasn't about performance, but peace. Ellen once said, "Portia has made me feel more loved than I ever imagined possible." And in a world that had so often torn her down, this love became the one thing that refused to break, because while the stage gave Ellen her voice, Portia gave her the strength to keep using it. For most of her life, Ellen DeGeneres was movement in motion, dancing down aisles, leaping across stages, always a step ahead of the world that tried to keep her behind. But even for the most tireless spirits, the body eventually whispers what the heart refuses to hear. And by her mid-60s, Ellen's body wasn't whispering anymore. It was screaming. In 2023, at age 65, she finally said it out loud. She was struggling. Behind the smiles, there was pain. Chronic back pain. Crippling arthritis. A quiet but relentless battle with osteoporosis that turned even simple movements into risky ventures. The woman who once made audiences rise to their feet was now wincing just to get out of bed. Then there was the mind. Obsessive-compulsive disorder. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. A brain that never slowed down, even when her joints begged her to. Ellen admitted that she once thought her restlessness was just part of being funny. But now she realized it was a form of suffering she had never learned to name. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't funny. It was real. She began reshaping her life around stillness, replacing adrenaline with acceptance. Long stretches, gentle walks, meditation, therapy not for show, but for survival. Therapy, she said softly, is a mirror I can finally look into without making a joke. And through it all, Portia remained at her side, not as a cheerleader, but as a caretaker, a partner who matched Ellen's slower pace, redesigned their homes for comfort, prepared meals to heal her bones, and held her hand through every flare of pain. Portia became the steady rhythm Ellen's aching body could trust. Their retreat to the English countryside wasn't a retreat from fame, it was a surrender to peace. Gone were the red carpets and flashing lights. In their place, misty hills, garden paths, open windows with the sound of birds instead of audience applause. It was quiet. It was slow. And it was exactly what Ellen needed. By 2024, she re-emerged one last time, not for the spotlight, but for closure. A farewell stand-up tour titled Ellen's Last Stand. Up and a Netflix special called for your approval. She joked. She confessed. She said goodbye. But this wasn't the Ellen of the early 2000s. This was a woman who had lived through every storm the public and her own body could throw at her. When the curtain fell, she didn't chase another stage. She went home. And for the first time in decades, she stayed there. Her life now? Slower, softer, measured in garden steps and quiet dinners. Her net worth? Close to $450 million. But her greatest fortune wasn't in dollars. It was in moments. Moments like Portia handing her tea on a cold morning. Moments like finishing a walk without pain. Moments like realizing she no longer had to perform for anyone, not even herself. Because in the end, Ellen DeGeneres didn't just survive the spotlight. She survived the silence that followed it. When the noise fades, when the audience goes quiet, when the lights finally dim, what's left behind isn't the applause. It's the truth. And for Ellen DeGeneres, the truth is complicated, woven with contradictions, lit by moments of brilliance, shadowed by seasons of backlash, carried by love, and ultimately anchored by survival. She was the girl who grew up silenced by trauma and became the woman who made the world laugh. She was canceled for telling the truth, then honored by a president for that very same truth. She built an empire on kindness, only to watch it crumble under accusations of cruelty. She hosted the Oscars, voiced an iconic Disney character, and redefined what daytime television could be. But she also endured exile, chronic illness, and public shame, all while trying to hold on to the one thing that had always been hers, her authenticity. Ellen's legacy isn't spotless, but it was never meant to be, because what she gave the world was never perfection. It was presence. She showed up wounded, raw, sometimes messy, often misunderstood, but she kept showing up. For the closeted teenager searching for a voice. For the lonely afternoon viewer in need of a laugh. For the women told to hide, and the misfits told to shrink. Ellen's story is a mirror reflecting not just her rise and fall, but our own expectations. Our hunger for icons. Our swiftness to tear them down. Our discomfort with complexity. And our failure to allow our heroes to be human. But here's what makes her story unforgettable. She never stopped evolving. Not after the sitcom was canceled. Not after the media turned on her. Not after her own body betrayed her. Instead, she found peace not on stage, but in stillness. Not in the roar of fans, but in the quiet loyalty of a woman who never walked away. In therapy. In honesty. In choosing herself, even when the world didn't. And that is her real triumph, because legacies aren't measured by perfection. They're measured by persistence. By how many times you got back up, by how many people you touched, by how bravely you kept telling the truth, even when no one clapped. So whether you admired her, questioned her, or watched her journey with your own mix of love and disappointment, Ellen DeGeneres left a mark. If her voice ever filled the silence of your home, if her laughter ever reached you on a hard day, if her resilience reminded you that broken things can still shine, then drop a line below. Tell us what part of Ellen's story stays with you. The rise, the fall, the kindness, The controversy, the pain, the survival, or the simple, quiet fact that she kept coming back even when the world told her not to, because in the end, maybe that's the most powerful thing she ever did. She came back, and that is a story worth remembering.